This is part three of Liberty, Democracy, and the Growth of the State. We've just finished discussing the phase of power's growth from warrior to king, and at this point there is no conscription. From the point of view of the common man, he pays less in taxes than the average American of the 40s would have paid to the government. As far as law, it's dictated mostly by custom and by religion, and so power is in a way limited both from below by custom in his relationships with the peasants and from above by the church. The next phase is the transition from king to monarch, and this is where things get very interesting. It's from the 14th to the 18th century. I'm going to go directly into our two metrics, conscription and taxation. First, taxation. At this point, the king is still only able to collect dues from the hierarchical level immediately below it. But there were special cases. If he wanted to lead a campaign for some cause that required extra funds, he would embark with his entourage on what you could call a begging campaign. This involved traveling to all of his provinces and appealing to the locals directly, which may or may not convince them to provide extra resources for his cause. Aside from that, he was limited to the incomes of his own estate and support from the church, which, assuming it agreed with his cause, might give him 1/10 of its own incomes for a certain period. So far, so good, and the power of taxation is still pretty limited. Then came the 100 Years' War, and everything changed. The 100 Years' War was really a very long series of smaller campaigns, which meant that according to the procedure we just mentioned, these begging campaigns were constantly occurring. And when something like that happens for over 100 years, it starts to feel normal because it has become normal. What was an exception becomes an expectation, and it's a great example of the power of arguing ad nauseum, which is a fallacy that works by presenting one's case over and over until the listener's judgment collapses under the weight of repetition. By the end of the period, power had achieved its greatest victory so far, the poll tax, which meant it could now count on regular dues not just from the dukes but from other levels of the hierarchy as well. Keep in mind that this had the dual effect of not only strengthening itself, but of weakening the other forms of power that existed at other levels, since it was drawing a portion of their resources to itself. It had successfully shifted the balance of power, concentrating it. To see what effect this had, we can look at the military force of Charles VII during the 100 Years' War period. He was able to command an army of 12,000 for 4 to 5 months, which would have been quite a thing at the time. Once the poll tax was achieved, however, there was a drastic change. The military campaigns were enabled to grow exponentially. By the 1800s, France had a military force 180,000 strong and Prussia 195,000. So now power has the ability to collect taxes. What about conscription? Well, there's still no conscription. Armies have grown, but that's due to the enlarged income of power and not its ability to compel people to fight. Using these great incomes, the king can begin assembling a personal guard, and we see the birth of the standing army, which is an army that is maintained during both peace and war. And a standing army seems normal to us, but at this point it was a revolutionary thing. And to see how revolutionary, we can listen to Montesquieu, who watched with horror as it developed. A new disease has broken out in Europe. It has infected our rulers and caused them to maintain armies which are out of all proportion. It has its recurrences and soon becomes contagious, inevitably, because as soon as one state increases the number of its troops, as they are called, the others at once increase theirs, so that the general ruin is all that comes out of it. Every monarch keeps permanently on foot armies which are as large as would be needed if his people were in imminent danger of extermination, and this struggle of all against all is called peace. To put this in context for Americans, we can also refer to the words of Thomas Jefferson on the subject, which should hit us pretty hard, considering the fact that America has the largest standing army in the world today. There are instruments so dangerous to the rights of the nation and which place them so totally at the mercy of their governors that those governors, whether legislative or executive, should be restrained from keeping such instruments on foot, but in well-defined cases. Such an instrument is the standing army. The spirit of this country is totally adverse to a large military force. Standing armies are inconsistent with the people's freedom and subversive of their quiet. We've seen that during this period there was an exponential increase in the extent of war, which we said earlier is a clear indication of an increase in the extent of power. We've seen that this was due to a victory by power which allowed it to concentrate more of the resources of society by achieving a poll tax. What we haven't mentioned is the state of law, and we'll look at that now since it also underwent a transformation during this period, and we can describe it as entering the second stage of divine sovereignty. This is the kind of divine sovereignty we've been taught to fear and hate. As power extends its reach, it also becomes an independent force. As it has the power of taxation, it no longer really needs the support of the church for any special campaigns, and so becomes independent from it in a revolutionary way. Likewise, as it can now maintain its own armies, it becomes independent of the nobles and knights on whom it used to rely. It moves from becoming one form of power among many to the sole power overshadowing all others. It no longer takes the form of a king, it takes the form of a monarch, and monarchs think differently than kings. So while law before was dictated by religion and custom, power began to conceive of itself as the source of legal right. To see that, just look at some of the words spoken at the time. James I of England, to his heir, God has made of you a little god to sit on your throne and rule men. Or Louis XIV. He who gave the world kings wished that they should be honored as his representatives by reserving to himself alone the right to judge their actions. He who is born a subject must obey without complaining. That is God's will. You are God's, even though you are mortal, and your authority is immortal. Now the transformation of the king into the monarch has been achieved. Taxation is in place, and power has expanded itself to command large armies without the need of support from nobles or the church, and it sees itself as a little god called to rule men. That's a bit alarming, but things are going to get much worse, as we'll see in the next video, which covers the Revolutionary Wars of the 18th and 19th centuries.